Hello everyone, this is the lecture on crustaceans based on chapter 20 of the textbook. It is going to be a very brief lecture, especially since we focus on the crustaceans in the lab when we dissected the crayfish. All right, we know we are in phylum Arthropoda, and Crustacea is a subphylum within phylum Arthropoda. It's one of the four main subphyla that you need to know. Remember, the others are Hexapoda, which we'll talk about next, Myriapoda, the millipedes and centipedes, which we already discussed, and the Chelicerata, which includes the spiders and other arachnids. But all right, subphylum Crustacea, basically the name of the phylum means that they're crusty. Their shell is crusty, as you saw when you were dissecting the crayfish, right? It is the thing that goes crunch when you crack open the shell of a crab. Now, most crustaceans are marine. There are a few freshwater crustaceans and very, very few terrestrial crustaceans like the little roly-poly or the pillbug that we all know. Now, crustaceans are some of the most abundant animals in the world. For example, the tiny crustaceans that form the zooplankton communities in the oceans are extremely, extremely numerous, and they can form the base or the foundation of the food web for many other oceanic animals, such as whales, that feast on those zooplankton communities. Now, I mentioned to some of you in lab when we were looking at barnacles that barnacles are sessile and they can't move, but yet they're sexual organisms. So how do they have sex when they can't move? Well, I'm going to show you a little video that's going to highlight that solution to that problem, but it also is going to bring up a very important concept called phenotypic plasticity.
Here's everything you wanted to know about barnacle penises, but were too afraid to ask. I'm Anna Rothschild, and this is Gross Science. Listen, barnacle penises are fascinating things. First of all, they're gigantic. Certain barnacles have penises that extend 8 times the length of their bodies, giving them the largest penis to body size ratio in the entire animal kingdom. Their sex organs are large for a reason, though. You see, barnacles are sessile creatures, which means that the adults attach themselves to something like a rock or a boat, and then basically don't move for the rest of their lives. But if you can't move, how do you find a mate? Well, one way is to grow a ridiculously long penis and use it to reach over and inseminate your neighbors.
Well, hello there.
And the longer the organ, the more partners you can reach and inseminate. On top of that, some barnacles can actually change how their penises look based on where they're living. Pacific acorn barnacles that live in calm waters tend to have long, thin penises, while those living in more turbulent waters tend to have shorter, stouter penises. This makes sense from a hydrodynamic perspective, since a shorter, wider, heavier penis would bend less and be easier to maneuver in a rough sea. The really crazy thing is that if you take a Pacific acorn barnacle that's lived its entire life in a turbulent area and you transplant it to a much calmer area, that same individual will change its penis size and shape to accommodate its new conditions. This neat trick is a great example of something biologists call phenotypic plasticity, which is the ability to change your physical traits in response to the environment. I realize that my enthusiasm about barnacle penises might sound a bit immature, but I'm in good company. Charles Darwin wrote extensively about barnacles and their reproduction, and he too was wowed by their penises. Ew. Got a question about barnacles? Let me know in the comments. And for more gross science, hit subscribe.
All right, I'm back. Hope you liked that video about barnacle penises and reproduction. The important part of that video is, well, a couple of things in the context of this lecture are that barnacles are crustaceans, even though they look very, very different. In fact, most people don't even see them because they live inside of this volcano-shaped shell. But the other important concept is this broader concept of phenotypic plasticity, which is that organisms can acclimate to new conditions almost in real time. Okay, notice that that is not adaptation. Adaptation is an evolutionary change to um, to environmental conditions through several generations, but phenotypic plasticity happens within the lifetime of a single individual. All right, so there's not much about this chapter that I really want you to focus on, other than that it can help you review some of the anatomy of a typical crustacean like the crayfish. So you can read this figure or the text around this figure to review your crustacean anatomy. For example, remember that a typical crustacean body plan is made out of two tegmata, the cephalothorax and the abdomen, but each of those two segments is itself segmented. So for example, the abdomen has these different segments, each covered in a tergum. And the other important part here about the external anatomy is this division of labor uh, uh, among the different appendages. So for example, here on the anterior end, we have these appendages that have been modified to be mouth parts, maxillipeds. Of course, the largest appendage in a typical crayfish is the caliped with its pincers at the end. Other appendages are for walking, other appendages are for swimming, and other appendages are for swimming backwards, the uropod. Here's a different view, or two different views, the dorsal view and the ventral view of the crayfish. And again, you can use this figure to review for what we learned in lab, the anatomy of a crayfish. And then lastly, here's this figure from your textbook that is also a good review of the internal anatomy. I think the most important things here are, well, the brain and a nerve coming out of the brain will extend downward toward the ventral side and then will run along the entire length of the crayfish on the ventral side, very similar to the annelids. And the crayfish has its intestine on the dorsal side. Over here on the anterior side, we have the antennal gland, or what your lab manual calls the green gland. Remember that gland is used for excretion, so the crayfish is almost literally urinating out of its face. And then here, I think this is the last figure I have in this slideshow. This is just another diagram of the internal anatomy of a crayfish here from the cross section. So you can again read this figure and the text around this figure to review the internal anatomy of a crayfish. All right, I told you this was going to be very brief. You have to read the brief intro to the chapter and just this quick section, the general nature of a crustacean, and focus on the external and internal features, mostly to review the things that we already read in lab.